Go wild, go wild.
And that is us live. Good evening, everybody. I was going to say Verona there, but for some reason that popped out of my head. But good evening, everybody. It's probably
say good evening to Ian Bruce. He's always there first. Well done. Well done again, Ian.
Sitting waiting.
Fastest finger.
Breath, sitting on YouTube, waiting Ian. Welcome along. Great to have you once again for our Blether with. So tonight we have somebody who's not directly involved in the industry as a guest, but has very much got a passion for whiskey, and so much so that he wrote a book, which is superb. And I don't know how many times we've said, "Oh, we should write a book," or "We could write a book." We've got so much to talk about, and so our guest tonight did that. He went and wrote the Scotch Missed, which Russell is doing his Debbie McGee impression there.
Absolutely, modelling away here.
being my wonderful assistant there. So Scotch Missed, a guide of distilleries, which are no longer on the go. And as a wee testament to that, I'm actually working my way through the lost distilleries.
You know, I was going to do that. I was going to pour myself. I've actually got the bottle down, the Jericho.
You've got Jericho. I have started off with the... Now Brian is going to dismantle me for the pronunciation of this. Ochnagee or Ochnagee?
Ochnagee? Well, Brian will tell us, I'm sure. I'm going to go with Ochnagee. I'm going to go Ochnagee.
Ochnagee, I'm going to go for.
And Mark McGee, he used to play for Aberdeen, of course. But
I bet you that was a Fergie line. Ochnagee.
Aye, probably. Gosh, I look like I've got jaundice again tonight, guys. I really, really don't. So I'm not. Don't write in. I'm not healthy. I am healthy.
You're almost the same colour as the dram, actually.
I know, absolutely.
So
I chose not to go for a Lost Loch one. That was so. Brian will be able to tell us more about that distillery when he comes on.
It looks like it's not far from Perth.
Okay.
By the map, maybe a little bit south, maybe kind of Pitlochry kind of area. Yeah, no, it's too far east.
Absolutely love all these old stories. Well, I've gone for a wee tribute tonight. Seeing as I didn't get a chance to have one the other night, in tribute for old Banksy, Little Brown Dog, that most of you probably will have heard, passed away this week. 15 was Banksy. 15, I think.
Yeah, about that.
And Andrew and Rachel's dog. So the Little Brown Dog. So I thought I'd pour myself a wee Tormore from the last release to
raise a toast to Banksy.
Raise a wee toast to Banksy. So yeah, I'm sure everybody knows all about it.
Had the pleasure of meeting her a couple of times. She's a bit of a celebrity, more so than Andrew is, I think.
She's a little brown dog. I mean, that's
yeah. So anyway, let's roll on, and I won't be here, unfortunately. My own Little Brown Dog is not so well, so I'm going to have to dash out once we introduce our guests. But Russell will be flying the flag, as he's done a few times before, going solo with Brian, and I'm sure it's going to be a great chat that you guys are going to have tonight. So let's get Brian on and say good evening.
Indeed.
And the stream.
Good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Thank you.
Evening, Brian. How are you?
Oh, very well, and all the better for speaking to you. And I've got a nice dram here, not quite in the classical glass, but I like it in one of these. And it's a slightly peaty one. I'm a great one for peaty whiskies.
Okay.
But I'll drink anything and thoroughly enjoy it.
So what is in your glass then, Brian?
Sorry?
What is in your glass?
It's, believe it or not, it's simply Glenmorangie peated. I think it's a very, very drinkable dram. It's not expensive. It's very enjoyable. I'm also a great fan of Ardmore, from not too far from you, in fact. Just down the railway line a bit. Yeah. And all in all, there are some wonderful and unsung peaty whiskies in Scotland, and I'd love to see more of them more widely appreciated.
Yeah, I like Glenmorangie. And I think as a retailer, we brought in the range before. Unfortunately, we can't compete with the prices, obviously, that the supermarkets put it out at. But they do some wonderful single cask Glenmorangie. Lady of the Glen had a fantastic one not that long ago, and Berry Brothers as well. The problem we have is that you walk into a supermarket and you see this great classic range. I think they're about £16 or something like that, and we're trying to flog a single cask of it for about £80, and there's just no competition. So, but it's a wonderful little drop, the Glenmorangie. I really enjoy it.
Well, one of the points, I suppose, is that people don't quite appreciate the sort of cost consequences of a single cask. If you're bottling a bottling run of maybe 80, 100, 200, 250 casks, the cost per bottle and per whiskey cost drops considerably. When you're doing a single cask, where every bottle has to be manually filled, manually labeled, manually stoppered, etc., it pushes the prices up. But at the same time, there are some wonderful single cask whiskies on the go, and I just wish there were more of them.
Absolutely. Glenmorangie do it quite well. They're handfuls. They've usually got a selection of handfuls in the distillery that are at reasonable prices as well. So they are one of the distilleries that do everything at an affordable price.
That's right. But they also, I mean, one or two of their recent bottlings was one which, was in Tokai casks, and they've had Barolo cask, and they've had one or two other specialist caskings. The prices have been sometimes well into three figures, and people are prepared to pay that for a really interesting malt.
They had they got their fingers, their knuckles wrapped a wee while ago. They released a cider cask, and they got told off from the SWA because cider casks aren't official.
Yeah, that's right. They must have got the pip.
The pip.
All right.
Excellent. That's good with that kind of night. I love it.
I can see you two are going to have a great night.
But one of the great joys of whiskey is that you can look and enjoy so many different expressions, even from a single distillery now. I mean, 10, 20 years ago, you got one Glenmorangie. Now there are about a dozen. And if you go to airport duty-free shops and places like that, there's another 6 or 7. I mean, it's, which of all these many different single malts of Glenmorangie would you choose? And certainly, I mean, I admit I like some of the ones they've got, the La Santa and the Quinta Rabanne and so on. But it's one of the great joys now is the great choice, not just a single malt, but of the choice within the single malt range. Yeah. Which must be a great boon also to people who really specialize in the best of whiskies.
Yeah. And like you say yourself, you quite fancy a peated dram. But there's now Speyside are back doing a lot of peated whiskey. We've got Islay doing non-peated whiskey. So every distillery is trying to get that range that attracts every style of whiskey drinker. It's not now the case of, I don't like Islay whiskies. It's like, well, have you tried a Bunnahabhain? Have you tried a Bruichladdich? Try this unpeated Islay whiskies and then find your way in that way. So it's very much more an opportunity for people to like from different distilleries or from one distillery maybe didn't like before.
Well, the interesting thing is that peaty whiskies are, in a certain respect, an acquired taste. I mean, I can remember when I was in my 20s or in my teens, somebody gave me a Lafroig. And it was like being, bashed in the back of the head with a sort of sledgehammer, because it was so different to anything I'd tasted before. But now, I mean, a huge range of peaty whiskies from Islay, including Lafroig, Lagavulin, Ardbeg, Bowmore particularly, and all sorts of others. They're my great joy. And I would, if I had to settle for one particular type of whiskey between now and when I pop my clogs, hopefully many years from now, then I would choose peaty whiskies. Make no bones about it.
Yeah. But your palate changes sometimes as you grow older. I mean, some people get into peated whiskies at a very young age. but quite often we've got a sweeter palate when we're younger, and as that more savoury palate develops sometimes as we age sometimes.
Absolutely true. That your, how can I put it? Your taste, your perception of taste, and your taste buds develop.
Yeah.
And with whiskey particularly, and you see, this is one of the reasons why if you have a good whiskey tasting, you start off with what we would call breakfast whiskies. You work your way through the lunchtime ones, and you get to the peaty and the stronger evening ones. And if you go through that lot, your palate develops because it's been preconditioned by the whiskey that went before.
Yeah.
But if you started your sampling with a very, very strong Islay, you would actually sort of anesthetize your taste buds for some of the milder Space Eyes and Lowlands that you might taste afterwards.
For sure, absolutely.
Yeah, and like you say, it's we have I had a trick with serving people in the shop. If they came in, they hadn't tried whiskey at all, and you were wanting to get into them, you'd give them a Lefroy as their first whiskey, and they're like, "Oh my god, I can't stand that." And you could follow that up with the line, "Well, every other whiskey is going to taste much better than that."
Much better.
You start them again that way.
Well,
they're great as well. So it's a win.
Yeah, that's right. Well, a friend of mine told me that one should perhaps sort of mention this, but why not? At the John Jameson Centre in Dublin, you get a whiskey tasting, and you get 5 different types of John Jameson, and they say, Irish whiskey is superior to Scottish ones, and to prove this point, they will give you a Scottish whiskey as number 6, and it's Lefroy. Well, let's face it, if you've been tasting sort of the nice, relatively smooth, bourbony, vanilla-y whiskies of Ireland, and you suddenly get a Lefroy, it'll hit you in the teeth. But it's not fair. It's not a fair comparison. It'd be like having a blind tasting of lager beers from various countries, and including in it Guinness. Because it's just not in the same league, or it's not in the same pattern. Yeah.
I mean, you've got a much greater knowledge of Irish whiskey than I have, for sure. I mean, Mike's better than me, but I mean, I guess we don't need to prove that we're better than Irish whiskies at the end of the day, I suppose.
Well, funnily enough, I recently wrote that Irish whiskies are getting better because they're trying to copy Scottish ones.
Yeah.
For many, many years, Irish whiskies were very, very like bourbon. They had a strong vanilla taste, but they lacked the kind of character that good Scots malts and also some of the good Scots blends have. And I think what has happened is, and it's largely thanks, I think, to John Teeling of Cooley, that they have improved Irish whiskies, and there are now some wonderful Irish whiskies which are underappreciated. For instance, there's a delightful peaty one called Connemara from Cooley. There's and the whiskies from John Teeling's son's distillery in Dublin is great, and there's a distillery called Slane north of Dublin and near the Battle of the Boyne, or the site of the Battle of the Boyne, which I think is absolutely outstanding. And there's also Writer's Tears and many other Irish whiskies, and they are really now spreading their wings. And okay, they're providing good competition for us, but competition is good.
Always. Yeah. Always.
And you're drinking a dram from one of our old friends, Graham Cool, who left Glenmurray, and he's now at Dingle Distillery in Ireland, and he's doing some wonderful stuff out there as well.
Yep. Well, as I say, the Irish whiskies are on the move, but then so are Scottish whiskies.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing in the past decade, after years of contraction and distilleries closing. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote my book was this ghastly feeling that so many Scottish distilleries, good ones, were being closed down. They're expanding now. New distilleries are being built right, left, and centre, and the same is happening in Ireland. The one thing I hope is that these will survive the current economic problems of high energy costs, of so many other factors coming in, which will make life difficult for them. But I do hope they will do well.
I mean, that's certainly a subject I'd like to discuss with you at some point tonight. Just talking about the reason behind writing the book. I mean, you published it the first in 1993. Is that
1993,
right?
That's right.
So when did you start sort of thinking about it and deciding, getting your research done, deciding this is going to be something I'm going to do?
I suppose it was about 2 or 3 years before. Yeah. There had been a lot of closures of distilleries, mainly in the Distillers Group Limited portfolio had closed. But also because of that, I think also distilleries belonging to other groups had closed as well. And I just sort of thought it was timely to write about this great scourge, almost this great cull of whiskey distilleries in Scotland. The ones in the 1980s and 1990s, there was about 20 to 30 in total. But I mean, compared to the great cull there was in the 1920s, as a result of the First World War, of high taxation, and of course American prohibition, the problems of the 1980s, 90s were relatively minor. But nonetheless, we always tend to think of Scotch whisky as a sort of license to print money. But in fact, the industry has been through periods where it's almost been brought to its knees, and we've now almost forgotten it. Yeah. And it was with that in mind that I wrote the book.
Yeah,
I'm chuffed because not only has it survived. I mean, it's come on, no comparison to Harry Potter books or anything like that. Within the whiskey world, it's sort of one of the books that people come back to.
We don't do politics and sport on these chats, so we're not going to go down the J.K. Rowling side of things.
Quite.
But yeah, I mean, the thing about, there's so many things to talk about tonight, and I'm trying to have some kind of order. But we'll come back to distilleries in a second. But the thing about books, and before we came on here tonight, I was thinking the thing about whiskey is these days you get into whiskey so much, you go down a rabbit hole that you're never going to get out of. There's so many different directions. So many different directions you go in. You end up thinking about wood, you think about yeast, you think about the environment, you think about water. You just go down so many avenues. But when you're thinking to yourself, I should slow down in buying whiskey because my budget's not so great, you end up buying lots of books.
Yeah.
So that seems to be the next thing you do. You just end up buying books and books and books, and every proper whiskey aficionado has got a shelf full of books. And obviously yours is one of the ones that's on there as a fantastic reference to let us know about the history and about all these distilleries that are no longer with us anymore. But just to kind of bring you back to what you were saying about the 80s, the 1920s, obviously there was a massive financial situation going on then that we could talk about later on. But the 1980s, it seemed to be much more, there was much more sadisticness about the destruction of the distilleries then. There was a lot of industry getting destroyed around about then, and it seemed to be cruel the way the distilleries were treated then.
Well, one has to remember that distillers, I can remember some quite senior person in the industry, but who didn't work for distillers, said, "Thank God distillers are so inefficient, it allows the rest of us to survive." But that was a sort of very, very sad reflection in a way.
Yeah.
And I know also that distillers had what really contributed to their downfall was not whiskey and not distilling, but the fact they went into pharmaceuticals and became the British distributors of thalidomide, which cost them millions. Yeah. I don't know how much it cost them, and it also damaged their repute.
Yeah.
And the end result was, I think, that they also didn't see the rise of the single malts. which, you know, was spearheaded by Glenn Grant and Glenn Fittich and certain others. And the result was that they had very, very big grain distilleries, especially in the Alloa area, which were simply too big, producing too much grain whiskey for which there was declining demand. And the result was that there were a lot of good distilleries which should never have closed, but they were closed due to circumstances. And I know at the time it caused great concern and there was huge worry about it. But I do think that for all its faults, the Guinness takeover of distillers and the subsequent amalgamations that led to Diageo has really been the savior of the whiskey industry.
Yeah.
And there's no doubt too that whiskey has suddenly acquired a kind of international, Scotch whiskey has acquired an international repute that sort of verges on the repute of, shall we say, champagnes and the best cognacs, which is fantastic. And the reason for that is you can now see that Pernod Ricard and other French companies, they have a big investment in Scotch whiskey.
Yeah.
And if you go into a French supermarket, there are more whiskies than brandies.
Yeah.
You know, there are about 40 whiskies on the shelves there, some of which you've never heard of, but they're perfectly drinkable blends, etc. They're produced in France, or they're possibly mixed and blended here and then sent to France and diluted. But nonetheless, they're doing well in that. And they are, but what astonishes me, go into a French supermarket, you have, you know, up to 40 whiskies and maybe 8 or 10 brandies and cognacs.
Yeah. We'd run a course, the Whiskey Ambassador course, and there's one of the facts that we tell people quite every time I say it, it astonishes me that the French consume more whiskey in 1 month than they do brandy and cognac in a year. It's just,
yes.
Yeah.
I can fully understand that, and the fact that quite relatively sort of obscure French firms like Picard from Burgundy, they've bought over, you know, they bought over the Highland Queen brand. They now own Tully Barden and so on. They've got a small but nonetheless vital foothold in Scotch whiskey, and also, of course, there are companies from other countries, including Thailand, even the Philippines, have a major investment in Scotch whiskey, and of course, the Japanese have had it here for years.
Yeah.
And essentially, one of the things that fascinates me now when I watch whiskey auction sites is the fact that the whiskies that fetch the top prices at the moment are not Scotch malts,
the
Japanese ones.
Yeah.
But one presumes, of course, that they're being bought by Japanese and Chinese and other Oriental investors rather than perhaps people in this country.
Do you ever wonder what might have happened had it not been for the Little Beetle?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Do you ever wonder what might have happened had it not been for the Little Beetle?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, you mean the aphid,
yes,
Phylloxera?
Yes.
Well, that's another sort of little piece of history that is now largely forgotten. But if the aphid Phylloxera hadn't infested the French vines, particularly in cognac, and you know the English, particularly upper classes, couldn't get hold of brandy and cognac for several years, and it allowed Scotch whiskey to make a step into the market. And the interesting thing too is, of course, at that time, vast quantities of sherry were coming to Britain, and these casks, the huge sherry butts, were lying on docks in London and elsewhere, and you could buy them for, hey, 6p.
Imagine.
Yeah, 2.5p in modern money. So, you know, the Scots, if nothing else, are financially shrewd. So they bought all these casks, took them to Scotland, put their whiskey into it, and of course, the whiskey that came out of them a few years later had a touch of the brandy or the cognac flavor to it, and it's been one of the great breakthroughs that we have to thank this tiny little insect for.
Absolutely, yeah. So I am going to jump off, guys.
No worries.
But just before I go, Brian, I was going to ask if you noticed the dram that I've got.
Yes, Ochnagee. Yes,
it was Ochnagee.
Ochnagee.
There we go.
That's
and
right.
Is that down your area? Is it?
Well, it was also called Tullymet.
Right.
And it was a small distillery in the hills, sort of above, sort of kind of above Pitlochry, but a bit downstream from Pitlochry. And it was quite small. It's only produced about 12,000 gallons a year, 12 times 5, so 50 to 60,000 liters a year. And it had been bought by Dewars. As a good source of malt. Mm-hmm. But they then, of course, built Aberfeldy Distillery, which produced much more malt and belonged to them directly, and they closed it down in 1912. But it probably one of the most enchanting of all chapters in Alfred Barnard's immortal book, The Whisky Distilleries of the United Kingdom, in 1885-86. Described Ochnagee as one of the most delightful distilleries that he'd visited, and he was saying that the distiller there, had his own sheep and chickens and goats and pigs, and had a lovely pastoral life. And it sort of also shows that distilling in those days had that kind of delightful rural quality. Which perhaps now we've become too professional, too organized, too industrial to appreciate.
Yeah, I do remember I went to visit Inchriach, which is a gin distillery outside Abbeymoor, and we got to the house. So there's a shed on the left-hand side opposite the house. So this kind of big mud car park, and then the right is the house. And so I phoned Walter, who is the owner and the distiller, and says, "Hi Walter, that's me here." And he goes, "Oh yeah, I'm just rounding up the chickens. I'll be round in a second." Straight after that, we seen this kind of this flock of chickens come around the corner, and Walter's chasing after them. So he was trying to gather it. So they are still about these great. I mean, it's a gin distillery, but the same kind of idea a bit.
Yeah, well, it's funny. The interesting thing, of course, with and the reason why I think so many of the new distilleries are distilling gin as well as whiskey is simply because you can redistill, rectify, and sell your gin tomorrow, whereas, of course, with whiskey you have to wait 3 years and a day, and in oak casks, and you've got to have the angels slurping away, and therefore distilling gin or vodka has a great advantage, because at the end of the day you can sell it now, and that provides cash flow. Exactly. I mean, somebody who starts a whiskey distillery and is prepared to wait 3 years and a day before they can start distilling it, the investment is horrendous. Yeah. And I admire the handful of people who have actually set up distilleries either from scratch or reinstated existing ones, such as Annandale, and have struck to making whiskey, and have had to wait, the 3 years, during which time you've got all this whiskey being produced and all the money that it's absorbing, and so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, you hope that people will enjoy and buy your whiskey. And you have to admire people who go into any business at the moment, but if you go into whiskey and strictly whiskey, by gosh, you deserve the Victoria Cross.
Excellent. Well, Brian, I'm going to leave. It's been an absolute pleasure. Hopefully I can catch up with you a later date at some point. I'm going to leave you in Russell's more than capable hands. So, guys,
No
enjoy the night, and I'm
love,
going to go and see
love to Tony and the dogs. Hope they're all okay.
Yeah, how we Rios do. So, thanks very much, Brian. And
my pleasure, Mike.
We'll speak to you later, Mike.
I hope next time I'm in Inverurie, I'll be in to see you.
Please do. Absolutely. We'll make a date of it.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Sure.
All the best.
Cheers, mate. We'll see you soon. So yeah, So we must get you into the shop. You've had a look through the windows, so you're aware it's a 2-story building.
Yeah.
And we've got a lovely tasting room upstairs now. The room was always there when Mike got the shop. So I think, gosh, I'm thinking now 6 or 7 years. I kind of lost count. I've been with him for 3. The shop's been there for 6 or 7, and we had a nice room upstairs, which was a bit like a sort of conference type meeting room that we used for tastings. But one of the things we were able to do during lockdown was to refurbish it. So it's got lovely stave linings along the wall. It's got a nice wooden stave type bar, and we've got a lot of some really good whiskies up there. So it's very much a tasting room and somewhere where you can come and get a dram of some of the stuff that's hard to get these days as well. So definitely make sure you're not driving the next time you're in Inverurie.
Yes. I'll come with a pre-employed chauffeur.
Absolutely. 7 years next week, says Mike. Absolutely. So I'm really keen to know a little bit just about you, Brian. I mean, I guess there's not an awful lot about you on the internet in terms of research, but what I did read was a multilingual retired journalist.
That's correct, and I still do a twice monthly column, which goes into the Dundee Courier and the Aberdeen Press and Journal, called Amber Lights.
Ah, okay.
And,
so is that a whiskey article?
And one of the things is that because of the time lag sometimes between what I write and what when it appears, I've always kind of said to the PRs in the industry, if they're sending me samples and so on, especially of very limited edition whiskies, I said, don't send it to me, because by the time my article appears, it'll be sold out anyway. But I've had a sort of passion and fascination for whiskey virtually since I was 4 years old. Although I haven't drunk it since that.
You might have had your sore gums. There may well have been whiskey rubbed onto your sore gums back then.
No, what happened was I lived in a street in Brechin in Angus, and at the bottom of the street there was Northport Distillery, which has disappeared in the early 1980s. And when I was only 4 years old, my granny and I were walking past the distillery, and there were 2 men frantically shoveling hot draft into a farm cart.
Yeah.
And the impact of the smell of the hot draft really hit me. And I said to my granny, "What do they do in this building?" And she says, "Oh, they make a drink called whiskey, and it doesn't taste nice." And I remember thinking, as with the logic of 4-year-olds, grown-ups must be daft if they've got this huge building of all these men working in it to produce a drink that doesn't taste nice. But of course, my grandmother came from the Victorian era, and she maybe had 1 sherry on Christmas morning and perhaps a sherry on Hogmanay night, and that was the sum total of drinking for the year. So to her, whiskey probably was, a whiskey that a drink that didn't taste nice. But that has planted the seed of curiosity that's made me interested in whiskey ever since.
Fantastic. Just before we move on, Ian McElwain has joined. He's watching from home, so he's just saying, "Nice to see you, Brian. Do you remember me?"
Oh, I can't say I do. I'm getting a bit gaga in my old age.
Ian had some photographs in your book. Ian's a photographer.
Oh yes, that's right. Yep. Well, it's very nice of him to be listening in. And hi, Ian.
Yes. The draft. The draft for me, the draft's the best smell in a distillery. I mean, people talk about the the mash, or in the washbacks, or the new make. But for me, the draft getting loaded into the farmer's trailer is the best smell.
Well, the thing I remember was it was, it was very small cart actually, with two wheels, but this must have been just at the very end of the war, and just when distilleries were starting up again, and it must have been sort of very much a small. Northport was never a big distillery, and I suspect also that barley was in short supply, and so they were probably producing in limited quantities, but at least they were getting going again.
Yeah.
And one has to remember that there are so many factors that can affect the production of whiskey. I mean, I often think, for instance, that a whole series of distilleries in Speyside and in other places have recently spent, or within the past few years, spent a huge sum of money getting gas mains laid into their distilleries, often down, miles and miles and miles of remote glen roads. And of course, they must now be wondering, is that the best thing to do? With the way gas prices going up. But they at the time thought it would be cheaper and more efficient than oil. But the fact remains that these factors are short term. They will hopefully improve, and that eventually gas prices will come down, and the unit cost of gas will allow whiskey pricing or whiskey distilling to become more cost effective again.
Well, indeed, and you touched on a good topic there. I mean, the Dunlunig distillery, which is on the site of the old Imperial distillery, Mike and I were able to go round there a couple of weeks ago. Gary took us round. He was very kind to do so. But the distillery there is only 7 or 8 years old.
That's right.
They're already having to look at refurbishing it to get the whole renewable and recycling source. So they're already having to look at actually upgrade that distillery. And people forget the cost, especially from an environmental point of view, the cost that distilleries have to put in to make them environmentally friendly.
Oh, quite. The cost of so many things. For instance, there's no doubt that liquid yeast is probably the most cost-effective and most efficient of yeast forms you can get compared to powder or cake. But at the same time, you have to install refrigerated tanks.
Yeah.
And true, some of the liquid yeast suppliers will help you price, with the finance of that. But nonetheless, it involves expenditure, and anything you do, I mean, including, replacing stills. One of the big breakthroughs, for instance, recent years, which has probably helped the industry, is the idea developed, funnily enough, I think, within Diageo, and that was that you should separate the still into the belly, the sort of upper part, the curve, the line arm, and so on, and flange or attach them together with flanges and bolts. Like that, if any one part of the still wears thin, you just replace that part. You don't have to replace the whole still, take out the roof, bring in huge cranes and so on.
Yeah.
And so, and I know, for instance, that Roseisle, the huge distillery that Diageo have built near Berg Head, that is entirely based on this idea of being able to remove parts of the still that have worn out quickly and efficiently without having to replace the whole still. And there's no doubt about it that whiskey, like so many other industries, has learned to become more financially efficient.
For sure. And I guess it has to. Absolutely. In terms of survival, we mentioned survival at the start of when we started speaking earlier on, and the concern that all these new distilleries that are coming on the go. I can't remember who it was we spoke to fairly recently. There was somebody fairly recently that we had a chat, one of our Thursday Blethers, who said that, to all intents and purposes, business would suggest that not all distilleries will survive. They simply can't.
Yeah, I think the ones that will struggle probably will be the newcomers, because they've probably gone out, or the distillers or the owners have gone out and borrowed heavily and so on, and they may struggle. I think well-established whiskies that have a good repute will survive, especially if they have the strength of a well-organized company behind them. Diageo is almost revered at the moment as one of the most efficiently run and one of the best run companies virtually in the business, not just in distilling, but in every other respect. And this will allow them, if they've got one distillery that's struggling, they can sort of subsidize it or provide financial support during its period of struggle. The ones that will be hard pushed will be the ones that are standalone single distilleries with perhaps a lot of debt, and I suppose. But this is a repeat of, in a way, some of the problems that faced some of the distilleries back in the 19th century.
Yeah.
After the great legal changes in 1823 that allowed really modern distilling to develop, hundreds of illegal distillers rushed into legitimate distilling. But nonetheless, by about the 1830s, 1840s, a lot of them, were not financially efficient, or were not producing the whiskey that people wanted, or couldn't distribute it properly, and they went to the wall.
And the thing I find quite remarkable, and I've mentioned the Imperial, one of the ones I've kind of read a little bit more about. I mean, there's so much to read about. There's so much information out there, thanks to yourself and others. But I was fascinated by the size of that distillery, and yet the short length of time that it was actually in operation for. It's quite incredible. The Imperial distillery.
Imperial.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, of course, it had it was quite fascinating because it was the only distillery, I believe, in Scotland that was built of red brick.
Yes. They've kept some of that red brick. They've kept some of that red brick in the new Dalmunich.
Yeah, but I'll tell you, I mean, there are distilleries. The really black period for short-term life of distilleries was, funnily enough, around 1900, and that was because of the collapse of Patterson's, the big whiskey blenders and brokers, because so many whiskey distillers had sold casks to them on credit. And when they went bust, I mean, huge number of distilleries either went to the wall, or were very badly hit. And I can remember, for instance, that Dallas Dew. I mean, it opened, I think, in 1899. It was closed in 1901. One or two other distilleries, one beside Cameron Bridge, I've just forgotten its name, old age. It was opened in 1899 and it closed within 2 years. And Charles Doig, the very great whiskey architect, who was probably one of the most driving forces within the industry, he commented after the collapse of Patterson's in 1900, he thought there wouldn't be another whiskey distillery built for 100 years.
Yeah.
And in a way, he was correct, because it was only after the Second World War, again, when American money was invested in the Scotch whisky industry, that a handful of new distilleries were either reinstated or built new, like Tormore.
Yes.
Funnily enough, Tormore is one distillery. I can't understand why it doesn't have much more interest, because it's architecturally one of the most interesting distilleries in Scotland. It's right beside the road. It has so much going for it. It could be such a tourist attraction, and yet it has no tourist center. It has no visitor center.
That's obviously going to change very soon, because Elixir, Elixir Distillers, the Singh brothers, that owned they owned Whisky Exchange, but they sold Whisky Exchange recently to Pernod Ricard, and obviously they've started building a new distillery on Islay called Port and Truin, which is a very interesting project. It sounds a really, really interesting project. They're not only are they building a new distillery, but they're also building a mini distillery. So they're going to be able to take people in their dissertation year of their degree that are going to be able to go and do their dissertation on site in the new Port and Truin. But as part of their kind of change in direction, they've also bought Tormore Distillery from Pernod Ricard. So they're just they're just in the process of kind of doing the handover, which I guess will take a period of time. And then once Elixir have got it as more of an independent type distillery, they will redevelop the visitor centre, and it'll be somewhere where we can go. I would like to think in the next maybe 3, 4, maybe 5 years we'll be having lots of whiskey from Tormore, and we'll get a chance to go in and see the new visitor centre there.
Yeah. Well, I must confess that I have, for years in my whiskey column, I have encouraged, cajoled distillers and distilleries to open up to tourism, because there's no doubt about it, whiskey tourism is a growth industry. And I mean, I also worked part-time as a tourist guide, and the one place that all tourists from all countries want to see when they come to Scotland is a whiskey distillery.
Whiskey distillery, yeah.
Some of them want to visit several.
Yeah.
And I can remember sometimes, I remember once I was at Glenkinchie, and the tourist guide who was I was acting as translator because I was doing it in another language. And the tourist guide asked, how many of the visitors have visited other distilleries? And about every hand in the group of tourists went up. And he said, and how many have you visited? Several of them said 17.
Wow, yeah.
And I don't know whether that was on one trip, but I do know that there are certain people who come to Scotland, and virtually they're there for 2 weeks, and it's 3 distilleries a day for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
They probably go to rehab after they get back home.
Liver transplant. Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
So you still do the tours?
Funnily enough, I specialize rather in taking disabled visitors around, especially in wheelchairs.
Yeah.
And the one distillery one must praise is Auchentoshan near Glasgow, because they are the one distillery that is actually set up for allowing wheelchair access
everywhere.
Yeah. And I would encourage other distilleries, and I know that some of them for construction reasons could never do it, but nonetheless, if distilleries can improve their disabled access, I'm sure that would also be a great step forward.
Oh goodness, yes, absolutely. Yeah. So you're still doing the tours then?
Yes, absolutely. And it's great fun, because the one thing, of course, is that very often I'm not just doing the tour, I'm also driving, and I will also praise many of the distilleries for the fact that at the end of the tour, if you're the driver, they give you the whiskies you would have got at the sampling in nice little bottles, and you take them home and drink them in the evening.
Absolutely. Well earned.
That's a great step forward.
A well-earned dram.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you're still writing for the Dundee Courier. What about the? I mean, going back to, you were aware of distilleries when you were a very young boy. So as you were starting to grow up, how did your fascination for the industry develop?
Well, believe it or not, my parents emigrated to Europe when I was 8 years old. Until I returned to Aberdeen University, I was, I must admit my involvement in whiskey was very small and almost non-existent. But once I got back there, I don't know, there's something about whiskey and distilleries and Scotland and the kind of cultural and historical things that bind it all together just always appealed to me. And it was, funnily enough, a friend who suggested to me at one point I should write more about whiskey. So I wrote an article, funnily enough, on lost distilleries.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, you know what you should do? You should try and make that into a book. And that's where it all started. So,
yeah. I mean, I guess back at that a particular time, it was almost seen as a bit geeky to be into whiskey. There weren't that many people that were into single malt. Not like now. You know, the amount of people that are into single malt now is huge. But there was a period of time it was very niche.
Well, it's true. And one of the interesting things is that sometimes you have to say you write a book ahead of its time.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps I did, but I'm delighted to see it. That in fact there is now a big interest in lost distilleries, and one of the great joys is to see people actually and organizations buying or acquiring old distilleries that have lain dormant for years and reopening them. I think the one that will really cause the biggest celebration will be Rosebank at Falkirk.
Yeah.
It was sort of it was greatly appreciated as a lowland malt, but I don't think people really lamented its closure at the time. But it has developed since then, and now that it is being rebuilt, refurbished, and so on and so forth, I think it will be a source of great joy and will bring a lot of. I mean, already Falkirk in fact, is one of the places in Scotland you never visited. But now, thanks to the Kelpies, the Falkirk Wheel, and soon the reopened Rosebank, it will become one of the places you go to.
Well, absolutely. And there's a real passion for things down in Falkirk. I mean, I remember meeting a couple of guys at Glendronach a couple of years ago who were heavily invested in the whole development. They were whiskey fans, but they were obviously, I don't know if they'd put some money into the to the development or not, but they were hugely invested in the area. But they were also Falkirk football fans, and there's just a proper passion for the whole area. I say I'm not going to talk about football, but just to kind of to back that up, the fixture that's coming up between Dunfermline and Falkirk is already a sellout, and that's a lower league game that normally I think it's even a third tier game in Scotland that normally wouldn't attract any interest. So the whole passion for lots of things in that area is huge, and whiskey therefore is bound to be one of them as well. And we forget about that. You're right, Falkirk's not an area that you would ordinarily choose to visit, but very passionate people.
I mean, there is already in Falkirk the new Falkirk distillery, and it's a beautiful and beautifully set up distillery, very close to the Antonine Wall, and that again is sort of contributing to the tourism dynamics of there. I mean, one of the things we have to remember is that actually Scotland, after many years of being sort of, this little forgotten country right at the north of the British Isles, but maybe people went to now and again, has really become one of the great tourist destinations of the world.
Yeah.
In fact, it's almost a problem because in Edinburgh, in the height of the summer, partly, of course, due to the festival and tattoo, but you just almost can't move.
Yeah.
It's so crowded. And but also it gradually people are discovering more and more interesting parts of Scotland. For instance, the North Atlantic 500 coast route and so much else. And and it's fantastic. And what's more, we should recognise, obviously, maybe in the future with global warming and restrictions that may come from that, tourism will decline again. But I think at the moment, tourism is Scotland's growth industry, and whiskey needs to be, in every respect, part of that. And I would just encourage any distillery that doesn't already have a visitor centre to look at doing exactly that.
I think lots of them, I think, are actually really keen to do that within the capacity. I think access is probably one of the biggest things that they actually have, but I think lots of them are doing that. But you're right. We Mike and I, well, Mike's got the shop in Inverurie. He's a Northeast boy. I was a Highlander originally, but I've lived in the Northeast most of my life. We very much see the Northeast as a tourist destination that not many people come to. You're right. People go to Edinburgh, they go to Islay, they go to the West Coast, but the Northeast of Scotland, Aberharder, for example, it's not exactly a tourist destination, but it's a beautiful area, and we're only 10 miles from the coast, and there's a host of distilleries here as well.
Yep.
But it may be
Yep, that's right.
Absolutely, but it may be that we can, with the help of your book, we can maybe actually start to. There's great tourism opportunities. We could start to do a trail where you visit all the sites of the old distilleries as well. That would be a fantastic thing to do.
That's a very kind thought. The only thing is that
lots of it's not there.
There's some distilleries where there are still vestiges there that you could show. But there are also some where they have completely disappeared. I think particularly there were 3 fantastic distilleries in Aberdeen, but you would be hard put to actually, with one exception, you'd be hard put to locate any of them today.
I think
North Scotland, you would be very hard pushed to place it. Strathdean, you'd be hard pushed to place it. The only way you can tell that the third one, which was the one on the river, is because there's still a sign actually on the slate roof as you go past in the train.
Yeah. But it's interesting you say that, Brian, because obviously the Bon Accord, I had no idea what the Bon Accord distillery was, but for many years, when I was a young teenager, an older teenager, not young, I was 18 and plus. I used to drink in a bar called the Malt Mill on Holborn Street in Aberdeen.
Yeah.
And that's obviously the kind of area where the Bon Accord distillery was. Yeah. At that age, I had no idea of the connection. But now I know that it's called the Malt Mill because of what was once upon a time there.
That's right. Yeah.
So even little bits about that, I think, would be a fascinating tour, a history tour.
Well, there are, I must admit, the Northeast has probably suffered more than any other area in terms of lost distilleries, because Montrose has lost Lochside, it lost Hillside or Glen Esk, Stonehaven lost Glenurry, Aberdeen lost, as I say, the 3 we mentioned, and then Peterhead lost Glenugie, Banff lost Banff.
Yeah,
and there are also a cluster of other distilleries which have disappeared. But again, the problem is that there's very, very little left of them. Partly because, of course, North Sea Oil or whatever has taken over the buildings, demolished them, and put something else there. And
But there is something about visiting an area, even though there's nothing there. If you've got somebody who can tell the story properly, it's a bit like visiting a battlefield, because most battlefields these days are fields.
Yes, that's true. That's right.
So if somebody can relate the story, then and you've got the information, so the work that you've done, fascinating work that you've done, really helps that. I talk about the Banff distillery all the time because it's just up the road, and there's 1 or 2 tragic but amusing stories about Banff as well, with the drunk cows and the birds on the beach and all that kind of stuff. But
of course, it had a particularly bad time during the war because it got bombed. And it sort of virtually caused all the casks in the warehouses to rupture, and flaming alcohol spread everywhere. And But again, I sometimes think I'm a great enthusiast for old railways, and I often think one could do tours of disappeared railway lines.
Yeah.
But again, it's often very difficult. The enthusiasts will go and look at it for themselves.
Yeah.
To hold organized tours, especially when there's maybe not that much left to see, is difficult. I mean, for instance, I really regret the closure of Glen Urie in Stonehaven, but it's now a huge new housings estate. There's just virtually nothing left to show where the distillery was originally. Glen Urie, I think, has virtually sort of disappeared because it's been redeveloped, and so many other, as I say, one-time successful distilleries. The one that I'm particularly overjoyed, though, that has been really rescued after many years in lying moribund, is Glenglassaugh.
Yes,
because it went through a very, very bad patch, but it has been rescued and is now very, very successful, and that's a great joy.
Yep, absolutely. Brown-Forman have got great plans for Glenglassaugh. I think that's
right.
That's for sure. It's a great whiskey and a wonderful site.
It is.
It's not the most attractive of distilleries, but it's beautiful in its own way.
Yes, I mean, and when I think too, not far from Glenglassaugh, slightly further along the coast, there is the much underappreciated distillery of Inchgower, Bucky.
Yeah.
And yet again, that's one that doesn't have a visitor centre, which is a pity, because it would be, I'm sure it could be, it's right on the main road.
Yeah.
And everything is there to make it. And what's more, let's face it, Inchgower, it's not got Glen in front of it, but it's a good whiskey. And again, it's relatively unknown because a great deal of it, of course, goes into blends. But I'm sure it could be it could be a great tourist center, and it's on the route. And of course, again, if there are more and more distilleries to visit, more and more people will come and dot along the coast to see them.
Absolutely, and there's another place that you'll be familiar with that you sometimes wish there was a bit more going for it in terms of whiskey. Is Keith, the town of Keith.
Yes.
I mean, you've got Strathisla, which is a great visitor attraction, but you've then got Strathmill, and you mentioned railways, and I'm a huge railway enthusiast as well.
Yeah.
And not only has Strathmill got a wonderful looking distillery, but it's also got a siding, and you just think, gosh, all you would need would be 2 railway carriages on that siding for your tasting room. It would just be fabulous.
That's right,
wouldn't it?
I mean, one of the distilleries I always wished I could find a bottle of, but there's no hope now because it's almost a century since it's closed, is Towie Moor, which is sort of midway between Keith and Dufton. And the site is still being used, but the distillery has disappeared. And again, you just wish that things had been different at the time. But I mean, in the 1920s, the combination of high taxation, the general strike, American prohibition, and there was also at that time a kind of mentality that, whiskey was, and all strong drink was the cause of all the evils in the world. That actually caused so many distilleries to close. And as I say, some of them would fully be still here and thriving if it hadn't been for that bleak period between the end of the First World War and about 1930.
Lloyd George.
Yeah.
I mean, was Towie Moor one of the ones that was in the Cabrach? Was that
the Cabrach?
Was Towie Moor one of the ones that was in the Cabrach?
No. It was as I say, midway between Keith and.
Okay, so not quite. Just kind of northeast of the Cabrach, then. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and it was, but it had always actually struggled a bit because even apparently one of the problems it had was that if you poured water into it, it went cloudy.
Okay.
And I don't know whether it was the water or what, but it meant that, for instance, the blenders wouldn't use it.
Yeah, yeah.
But again, I mean, you think of it, just even Dufton, which we regard, as the sort of one of the centres of whiskey, thanks to Glenfiddich and the Balvenie and Kiningvie and so on, and of course Glendullan and Dufton Glenlivet. But it's lost 3 or 4 good distilleries in the past 30 years. It lost Pitty Veich, it lost Cornwall Moor, and one other which has gone out of my head. But it's so sad. It's just the way, I suppose, whiskey is a business. Whether we like to go sentimental about beautiful tastes and flavors and whatever, it's still a business. And if the whiskey doesn't make, or the distillery doesn't make money, the bean counters point that out, and eventually management brings down the hatches.
I'm just wondering if Gordon and MacPhail have maybe got a wee cask of Towie sitting somewhere.
Well, if Gordon MacPhail have it, they'd easily get several £1,000s a bottle. So.
Yeah.
The point is, if it's been in the cask that long, it'll probably be. I remember once hearing that they discovered this wonderful cask of whiskey. I can't remember which distillery. It was possibly Bowmore, and they'd forgotten about it, and it was absolutely perfect. It was, I can't remember how many years old. They could have sold it for a fortune, but it was 39.5% alcohol.
Wow. Okay. Oh, dash.
And the only way they could bring it up to 40 was to add a much younger whiskey.
Yeah.
Which,
disaster. Disaster. There's a time and a place for bending the rules, I think, really, isn't there?
I think the rules that were brought in have helped the industry.
Mm-hmm.
They came in the 1980s. I mean, one of them was that has helped malt whiskey, single malts enormously, because you remember that was a period when we were sending millions of gallons of Scotch malt whiskey abroad to improve the whiskies of other countries.
Yeah.
In Spain or in Japan and elsewhere. That's daft. I mean, I remember actually recently seeing a bottle of Japanese whiskey. And I thought, oh, that looks interesting. Oh, I've never tried it before. And then I kind of looked on the back, and it said a blend of world whiskies matured in Japan. So it wasn't a Japanese whiskey at all.
It would have been Ben Nevis.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
Indeed. Absolutely. So, I mean, in terms of some of these lost distilleries, the Lost Distillery Company that are looking, I mean, Mike had a bottle of the Akinagi tonight, and I've got a bottle of the Jericho.
Jericho, yes.
Have you tried some of these whiskies from the company?
I'd love to, but I haven't tried them yet. But I must admit, Jericho, I have a particular passion for because, as I say, it was called Jericho. It stood on a burn called the Jordan. And the idea is that this sort of very biblical setting was producing whiskey. It was very amusing, and of course, it also produced a whiskey called Benahee.
Yes.
In fact, that was the whiskey the whiskey they produced was called Benahee.
Yes.
And there was, during the 1980s and 90s, there was a whiskey called Benahee with 2 ends rather than one that was produced. And one of my prides and joy is I've actually got a bottle of it.
Oh, the Benahee, yeah.
Benahee, yeah.
I'll get a sample of Jericho down to you.
That is very kind of you. But as I say, I'll be up to Inverurie sometime, and I'll be in touch on the blower and arrange to come and say hello.
Ian's telling us that the malt barns are still in place. I'm aware it's a farm now, and I think the farmer who has the farm is not particularly welcoming of people wandering about. So it's not one of these places you can go and have a proper look. But Ian's definitely been there. And I know he took a photograph for your book of Jericho, of the malt barns, which he says is now full of boats. Maybe when he took the photograph, or maybe cows now, I don't know.
Of course, the funny thing is that you can always recognize a building that has been used for storing whiskey, because even if there's no iron bars now left in the windows, if you look up and you look down, you can see 5 or 6 holes that have been filled in with cement, top and bottom, because the iron bars used to be there. Then if you go around Leith, you can go for miles down streets there. And if you look up particularly, they've usually put new lintels on the bottom. But if you look up, you can see 5 little holes plugged with cement. And that was because they were whiskey warehouses, and that's where there were iron bars on the window.
There's lots of biblical terms about the area around about Bennyheath. There's a road called the Lord's Throat on the other side of where Jericho is, and obviously the area is known as Paradise as well, which is kind of written about. But it's interesting you talk about Edinburgh. We were talking to Nick Ravenhall last week. Nick's the director of the Holyrood distillery, the new Holyrood. So he's a Kiwi. What a great lad. Fantastic. And they're really looking to reinvigorate the whole whiskey scene in Edinburgh as well. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, Edinburgh has a phenomenal range of lost distilleries, some of which are, I mean, quite historical. There's one called Cannon Mills, and in the very bad period of bad harvests, I think sometime in the 19th century, it was reputed that the distillery was hoarding barley. I mean, at a time when people were almost starving, and there were riots at the gates, and there are, I say, a whole string of very interesting distilleries in Edinburgh. And then eventually they all seem to close down. Sunbury, Caledonian, and so on. The only one that was left is North British, which, funnily enough, it's of course a grain distillery, and it is, I think, the one distillery, it's maybe changed, but it was the one distillery left in Scotland, the grain distillery, that still distilled using corn on the cob, maize, instead of wheat. Yeah. And if I was taking a group of French visitors around Edinburgh, I used to say to them, well, if you get a chance, buy a bottle of North British single grain, because it'll be distilled from grain from your country, because the malt, the maize they bought came from France, not America.
Right.
And whether they ever took my advice, I don't know. But I can't stress enough that I think the tourism is the great growth potential area of Scotland, and it is and whiskey distilleries should cash in on it.
Yes, absolutely. But also the history, because we love Scottish history. We love Scottish history, but people love Scottish history, and Scottish history is not often. It is often misrepresented, and it's not often discussed a lot. For example, when I was at school, I mean, I don't know what it was like when you were at school. I hated history, absolutely hated it, because it was just nonsense. Yeah. But if you'd been telling me the kind of stuff that I'm learning now about history, I would have been fascinated. Yes. I think we've got the wrong end of the stick with history. I think we misrepresent it really quite badly.
I think, of course, history tended, of course, to be very much focused on battles and kings and so on and so forth. What is great is that we now look at social, commercial, and other aspects of history, which give you a far fuller vision of the way people lived, and the way why certain situations developed. I mean, the one thing that I always come back to is that, okay, we're living in the age of the computer and the social media and the smartphone and so on and so forth. But if you had to look at one thing that transformed Britain more than anything else, it was the railways.
Yes.
And the fact that remote distilleries, which up to that point had everything taken to them by horse and cart and taken away by horse and cart, they could now get coal, they could get grain, they could get malt from further afield, and they could then ship their barrels of whiskey to London, to Edinburgh, to Liverpool for export, and so on and so forth. And even in the north of Scotland, certain railway lines, I'm quite convinced, would never have been built if it hadn't been for the whiskey industry.
Yeah, for sure. And, absolutely, the north coast along here. And but people will often say when we take people on tour, because through the shop we do tours as well. So when we take people out on tour, people often say to us, "Why on earth is there a distillery here? It's in the middle of nowhere." They say, "Well, but it didn't used to be. There used to be a railway used to run alongside here."
That's right.
And people find that really hard to believe. And you mentioned Annock and Knockdhu. You can still see where the line used to be. But the countryside round about it, you think, wow, I can't believe a train actually came along here.
Yes. Well, one has to sort of look back on the fact that in the early 1960s, thanks to Dr. Beeching, huge numbers of railway lines that, frankly, with the benefit of hindsight, should never have been closed, were closed.
Yeah.
And it is absolutely astounding, for instance, that and thank God they were, but the lines, for instance, to the Kyle of Lochalsh and to Mallaig were preserved because they are now huge tourist attractions. And they are wonderful railway lines to travel along. And the fact that, of course, that the Harry Potter films were shot on the Mallaig line. So you've now got the Jacobite train running every day and so on. But that again is proof that what seems a good idea today may prove to be not such a good idea 30, 40 years down the line. And this is, funnily, of course, this is one of the big political disputes at the moment, that investing in more fossil fuels perhaps seems necessary in the short-term situation we're in because of the Ukraine war, but perhaps 10 or 20 years from now, it would have been, we should have continued perhaps with a policy of trying to decarbonize. But you can never tell.
You can never tell. Yeah. Indeed, absolutely.
That's one of the things, though, that I will praise the whiskey industry for, and that is that with the use of heat exchangers and so many things, they are gradually being able to cut down on their fuel consumption. Because let's face it, whiskey making is fuel intensive. And
yes, indeed. One of again, I mean, you're talking about water recycling is one of the things that I'm no engineer at all. Glengarry have got a fantastic water recycling plant just now. Yeah. They've just started up, and of course they started their malt floors as well. And I kind of get a little bit about what happens, but I don't understand how. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. But one of the things that I often have discussions about when we're in distilleries is the heat, especially when you're in a still house. That ambient heat is how or why they're not able to maybe recycle and use that heat.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I've felt it as well. I suppose you could probably put insulation around the stills, but again, I suppose the tradition of beautiful copper stills and the visual delight that they impart
Insulation, also insulation around the hill. I spoke to somebody about that, and they were saying if you were to put insulation around the stills, that would have an impact on that process.
Yes, that's correct. That's right.
So
I suppose we will eventually discover a kind of carbon or relatively carbon neutral way to distill whiskey, but we're not there yet. But I'm sure there'll be some engineer, some scientist who will eventually come up with an idea which would allow, as it were, the amount of energy needed to produce a gallon or a liter of whiskey could be reduced sharply, but at the same time it will still be produced, and it will taste as good as ever.
It's definitely a tricky one. I remember fairly recently having someone on tour come around the distillery. It was only his second ever distillery. He was just newly getting into whiskey, but he was a jeweler and a goldsmith, and he said that he was aware, or because of his scientific knowledge, he was aware that you could make whiskey synthetically. It would be possible to do that, and I was thinking, well, okay, that sounds horrible to me. I'm not sure. I'm not sure the romantic in me would want to drink something that was just made synthetically in a lab, if you like, where you could have it made in a distillery.
I'm quite sure that you could take ethane gas and blow it through some kind of combustion chamber, or not combustion chamber, some kind of chamber, and at the end of it, pure ethanol will come out the other end. The interesting thing is, would we want to drink it?
Well, exactly. And where would be the romance in that?
That's right. And but I suppose we live in ever-changing times, and I suppose a time may come when we will. I can't see whiskey ever being produced synthetically, but I suppose a time will come when we will find ways of producing it for considerably less energy input, and I think that would be the industry itself would welcome it, because I suspect that their energy bills, especially at the moment, must be going through the roof.
Well, indeed,
and that of course affects the price of the basic product, and therefore the product 10 years from now.
Yeah. So do you obviously you visit distilleries down your way? Do you get sort of like much of the way across Scotland, or do your tours focus on the kind of central belt, or where do you?
I tour around Scotland. I've also done tours of over the years. I've done big tours in England and Wales and Ireland.
It's the new ones down
there. But Scotland is the best, and I always rejoice when we have a tour I'm doing involves a stop at a distillery or two or three. And
absolutely. Do you have a favorite distillery to visit these days?
Well, I would say that for various reasons, there are, as I say, a restricted number of distilleries I tend to visit, because I'm always with groups primarily who are disabled, often in wheelchairs. So it tends to be those that can accommodate. But I also have to sort of praise a number of distilleries that are, although they can't do a full tour, are still very, very welcoming, very, very helpful. And as I say, I'm delighted, because I think a distillery is part of visiting Scotland. Just like if you went to Germany, you want to visit a brewery, or if you went to France, you would want to visit a good vineyard.
Yes, absolutely.
Or maybe a cognac vineyard. And therefore, whiskey is very much part of the Scottish experience. And the more distilleries that get in on the act, the better. And I notice they are. And in fact, some of the new distilleries I notice virtually the visitor centre is almost as important in the way it is set up as the distillery itself. For instance, Lindores Abbey they've done a fantastic visitor centre there, and a fantastic congratulations to them.
Oh, there's so much to read there. I mean, you really need. It's not one of these ones you could stop and pass, have a whiz round the site, and have your drams and disappear. There's so much to take in.
Right. Of course, it is a very famous historic site. It's where Friar John Core we regard as the father of Scottish whisky distilling.
Indeed.
It's first noted to have distilled whisky in 1494.
Fabulous. And did you get to meet Drew? Have you met Drew?
Oh yes, absolutely. Delightful man.
Cracking character. I love the fact that he tells you that he's almost ashamed to admit, but he admits that he used to drive around the site on his motorbike when his grandfather owned, before they ever did anything about redeveloping it, and now realizes that wasn't a clever thing to do.
Well, you know, there's one distillery I would like to see rebuilt and restored in Scotland. It's one called Stronachy.
Yes.
It's at the top of, it's sort of on the boundary between Perthshire and I suppose the original border between Perth and Kinross. But it was built where it was built specifically to be about 100 yards north of the Highland Line, the famous Highland Line, right? Yep. Which made it a Highland whiskey. But what was delightful about Stronachy was that it had its own private railway, narrow gauge, and it ran down the hill from the distillery into the valley. And the trains pulled loads of barley and coal up the hill to the distillery, and barrels of whiskey down the hill towards Milnerthort to be shipped off to wherever they had to go. And they had a very, very ingenious but simple system for pulling the trains, and it was a tractor. Because it was a narrow gauge line, the tractor wheels were outside the rails and the sleepers, but of course it gave them. It meant that the tractor could pull it uphill and pull it down, or break it downhill, whereas a steam locomotive would have been, you know, its wheels would have been skidding the whole time. Yeah. And as I say, it was ingenious, and the system, funnily enough, was, though it wasn't specifically copied on the system at Stronachy, it was actually used in many other countries, particularly in the Commonwealth. Narrow gauge line, but to pull the trains, you use a tractor, which had big wide tires. Yeah. And what they did to be able to make sure the tractor ran in the right direction, the big rubber tires were on the outside, but the front wheels
were in the inside
wheels that actually ran on the track.
That's just brilliant.
Absolutely brilliant and dead simple.
Yeah.
And as I say, I would love to see Stronachy restored. It was closed in 1929. It belonged to Sir James Calder, great name of that particular period. But like all distilleries at that period, they just couldn't tackle the rise in taxes, the American prohibition, and everything else that was the big, you know, it was the bleakest period of Scottish whisky. And it's great that the Scottish whisky did in the end pull through, and is the thriving industry it is today.
And of course the Stronachy name is still surviving. I think it's Adi Rattray, I think, has got the Stronachy name. So you still got a whiskey named Stronachy, but I think they're using Ben Rinnes whiskey for the bottle. So you can still buy a bottle of Stronachy, but it's not from, obviously.
That's right. It's from Dura Rattray in Maybole.
Yeah,
that's right.
I think it's Ben Rinnes. It's in the bottle. I think.
Yes, that's right. And yes, it's. I think it's distilled either Ben Rinnes or Ben Riach.
Yeah.
But it's very drinkable. So it's a nice dram. Fabulous. And but as I say, it would be wonderful to see Stronachy rebuilt, and possibly with the railway.
Yeah.
And I imagine nowadays, of course, they would have a little cog railway, and probably with the Swiss locomotives, you know, chunking up the hill.
So there's a few people been making comments online, guys. We've been chatting away for a wee while here, but just listen. Anybody that's actually listening in, feel free to ask any questions. As I see a comment from Willis there, just saying that'll please you, Russell. Willis was one of our academy attendees in September. Gosh, where are we now? September, yes. My love of tractors and everything farming is becoming well known with the guys that watch and listen in on a regular basis. I'm a bit of a tractor geek. But anyway, no. Listen, Brian, just a few more questions, I guess, just for yourself. And this chat is fascinating. We started talking about single cask ownership before we went live, and you were telling us that you've just bottled a lovely Glencadam at 10 years old, and you were saying it was great fun.
It was. I mean, what really helped is that I've known and been on good terms with Glencadam for many years, and also with the Hillman family, who run Angus Dundee Distillers, or own Angus Dundee Distillers, and the manager at Glencadam, Doug Fitchett. But I've also had a kind of deep attachment to Glencadam, A, because I'm a Brecioner, and two, because, would you believe, my grandparents are buried in the cemetery just beside the distillery.
Oh, wow.
And
wow.
would you believe that the distillery effluent pipe actually runs through the cemetery down towards the South Esk. So I've got sort of lots of connections there. And what's more, I think it is one of it's a very, very fine whiskey.
Oh,
and,
goodness, yes, absolutely.
And the thing is, of course, because it's comes from Brechin. It's not one of the kind of Glenlivet whiskies, and perhaps it's underestimated. Although, of course, it's a great fact that the Betty Boothroyd, who was the Speaker of the House of Commons for many years, and delightful lady, Glencadam was a favourite whiskey. She wouldn't drink anything else.
Really? Okay.
So I think actually I would encourage, as I say, anybody but to try and buy a cask of whiskey, provided they can get it at a reasonably good price, and B, always do it with a syndicate. Yeah. Because shall we say, if you have 10 people in the syndicate, then it ensures that everybody has a sort of number of bottles that are drinkable within a given period. Yeah. If you're doing it by yourself, you're suddenly landed with 240 or whatever number of bottles in 10 years or whatever time. And what do you do with them? But if you do it as a syndicate, and it's well run, and the firm you're dealing with is helpful and kind and cooperative, it's a great experience, and it's also intensely enjoyable.
Yeah.
And also at the end of the day, you have a whiskey which is quite exclusive. It's your own.
Absolutely. I mean, you're right. Glencadam's one of the best spirits out there, and underestimated. We speak about it, but you're talking 1825. It's very exciting to think that in 3 years' time we're going to have a 200-year centenary of. Well, you've got, it's one of your favourites. It's one of my favourites. I just love the fact that I'm going to have hopefully in my lifetime a 200th centenary of one of my favourite whiskies. It's just going to be fantastic.
Well, the interesting thing, of course, is that there are quite a few distilleries will be coming up for their bicentenary in the coming years, because of the great Excise Act of 1823, which really put the Scotch whisky industry on its modern footing. And we also, funnily enough, in a way, indirectly have to thank King George IV for that, because he came up to Edinburgh in 1822, first British monarch to come to Scotland since the ouster of the Stuart kings in the 1680s, 1690s. And the first thing he did when he arrived in Edinburgh was he insisted on having Glenlivet whiskey, which at that time was illegal. So, and he wouldn't drink anything else. So they had to sort of look around Edinburgh to try and find this whiskey, and probably found it in some of the households of some of the leading citizens, pillars of rectitude. And they had got it. And anyway, he enjoyed it. And although you can't post a direct connection, it is significant that in 1823, the year after the King's visit to Edinburgh and his desire to drink Glenlivet, that finally, they introduced decent system that for the first time allowed legitimate distillers to earn a living. Because up to that point, the taxation system and the restrictions made it impossible to make decent whiskey and earn a living, which is why so many people smuggled and distilled on the QT.
Absolutely fabulous. I mean, the smuggling story is fascinating as well. I love Charles MacLean. I can't remember who he co-authored it with. Book about the smuggling in Scotland as well, and particularly this area where I live in. Banff in particular was an absolute hotbed of illegal activity, which I think is just the stories are just wonderful. That they jailed an exciseman for 4 days on no trumped up charges because they were obviously busy with illegal activity, and then released him 4 days later saying, "Oh, I'm really sorry, that was a mistake. You're free to go on your way." But of course, by that time they'd done everything they needed to do. I think it's fantastic.
Well, of course, the irony of the situation was that many of the illegal distillers, if they were arrested by the gaugers, they would be brought before the courts or before a JP, who was probably a customer of that particular distiller. So he would probably lecture him and waggle fingers from the judge's bench. And then sort of fine him sixpence or something like that. But in a way, of course, the system was crazy, and one has to thank many people who, including probably King George IV, for the fact that they finally sort of were able to convince the government in London to make legitimate whiskey distilling viable. And in a way, if it's the success of the whiskey the distilling industry 200 years on is thanks to the steps that happened in 1823.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we needed to have some kind of order at some point, despite the fact that we enjoy being disorderly.
Well, I suppose one of the things is that it is always easier to do things legally than to do things illegally.
Yeah.
But the problem is, if you make it so difficult or so financially prohibitive to do things legally, people will turn to will do thing illegally or even criminally.
Yeah.
And when you look at the in a way, it was a tragedy because it pitched perfectly decent excisemen who were just trying to do a job, and perfectly decent farmers, perhaps, who were also trying to earn a living against each other.
Yeah.
Whereas, in fact, they should have been cooperating.
Yeah.
And I see. I know this is probably those sound very political, but I sometimes think that I see a slight parallel today with Brexit, that in fact it would probably and even now some of the people who were the most adamant supporters of it seem to be sort of shifting over to a point where they think maybe it wasn't such a good idea after all. And I see even some of the bastion supporters in the press of Brexit are now starting to say, yes, perhaps we should do a fresh approach to Europe. And you learn from experience.
Well, indeed. I mean, we I guess we always try to avoid politics, but I guess on that point, I think the most telling thing was anybody who wins a referendum, when they win it the next day and think, oh shit, I never thought we were actually going to win, then you know then you know there's a problem, So okay, we didn't actually want to win, so
that's a good point. Yeah.
So I mean, I guess just a few other kind of things. Talking about cask ownership, obviously a cask of Glencadam was a no-brainer for you. The homegrown dram, and a good one to boot. If you were able to own a distillery, which distillery would you like to own?
Oh dear. Oh dear, that's a difficult one. Oh, goodness me. I would have to confess, that's a very difficult question to answer, because there are so many distilleries I like, and so many I would be very happy to own. I suppose in a way, the one distillery that I sort of always have a sneaky admiration for, and always enjoy the whiskey that comes from there, is Dalmore. But I would have to be a multi-millionaire to acquire it, so I couldn't do it. I think what I would probably do is look around for a small... Sorry?
I never said there was a budget.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's true. But I think what I would probably look for is a small distillery that was established in recent years, but is struggling a bit, and buy it and hope to build it up. But having said that, I mean, I love whiskey. I love distilleries. I love everything to do with it. But I don't know if I would be actually a very good distiller if I had to live on site and run the business. There's a big difference between enjoying the food in a restaurant and being the chef there.
Absolutely. Well, we spoke about Drew Mackenzie at recently with Lindores, and when Drew came on to our Blether, gosh, it must be over a year ago now. He was telling us about his meetings with the late great Jim Swan, who obviously helped him to set the distillery up, and because Drew himself was a chef. And at a reasonably good level, and as part when they were discussing the development of the distillery at Lindores, he'd said to Jim, should I be the distiller? Should I be making the whiskey? To which Jim replied, "Good God, no." We need to get somebody else in who knows what they're actually doing.
Yes, that's right. I think I would be the same thing. I mean, I'm fascinated by all aspects of the production of whiskey. I mean, I'm always fascinated by the malt mills in the distillery, and I always check to see if they're Porteous or if there's some other make. I like looking at the mash tuns, checking whether they're made by Forsyth or maybe made by one of the other big metallurgy firms in Scotland, and I'm always interested in how much grist they put, or how much grist they put in, and how much water and what temperature and so on. I'm fascinated by the washbacks, whether they're Oregon pine or steel, and whether they use liquid cake or powder yeast. I'm fascinated by the stills, the shape, size, whether they use worm tubs or condensers, and 101 things. But actually to sort of do all that myself and be in charge, I don't think I would be, I would enjoy it the same way.
No.
It's like I said, it's like the joy of eating in a good restaurant and suddenly becoming the chef.
Yeah, it's a different story when you've got to do it yourself, isn't it? Absolutely.
That's right. And I suppose also, I've been a journalist all my life. I mean, I do tours as a separate sort of second string to my bow. And the one joy about journalism is you can go around the world, you can dip your toes into every pond, You can take an interesting story out of each pond. But if I had to live permanently in one pond, no, I would find it very dull.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
When we were talking about some of that funny stories about the judges and the JPs and stuff like that, Ian McAllister from Glen Scotia, you'll know Ian well, I'm sure. But he's just saying that Angus Matten, the noted Kintyre author, mentions a lady who appeared before a justice to face smuggling charges, who at the discomfort of the judge stated that I hadna smuggled any since the last lot I gave to his lordship.
Precisely. Perfectly true. Perfectly true. There was a woman in Campbelltown who was famous or notorious for smuggling whiskey sort of under her petticoats.
Yes.
I don't know what sort of hot, bottles or bags or
it was a bag,
bladders or whatever she transported the whiskey in, but that was the way she got it into town.
Yeah. What was her name? The actress, Joanna Lumley. Joanna Lumley, on one of her sort of travel logs of Scotland, visited. I think it was Glengoyne, wasn't it? That she went to Glengoyne and she reenacted the story of the person with, and it was bags of whiskey she had under her petticoats.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely fascinating.
Well, if you think of it, the all sorts of things, all the different devices that were devised for smuggling whiskey. Remember these copper body kettles that you fitted under your arm, or you stuck down your boiler suit. They were classic. And of course, it was the famous copper dog that you
taking the dog,
like your dungarees,
taking the dog for a walk. Yeah,
yeah. And I was talking about Stronachy Distillery, and apparently the management knew perfectly well that before they had the railway, the whiskey barrels were carried on the back of a horse and cart, and that the horseman or the carter, it's a guy called Bain. I don't know what his first name was, but he sort of had a long straw, and he would pull the bung out of the nearest cask and put the straw in there and drink whiskey virtually all the way down from the distillery to Milner Thornton. Was probably absolutely bloated by the time he got there. But, as I say, the great thing about whiskey is there's so much humor that goes with it. And
I know.
And it's a particularly joyous subject. Yes. And last but not least, it's a kind of great. It's the biggest village in Scotland. People who are in the industry seem to know everybody else.
Yeah. And so friendly, and you'll have found this as well. But for me, my career was in the NHS. I just retired just over a year ago, so I've been working in the shop for 3 years now. So I'm that's completely gone. That part of my life has ended. My new life is now in whiskey and spirits. I've never in 40 years of working in the NHS, I never met so many friendly people that I have in the 3 years I've been in the whiskey industry.
Absolutely.
And people willing to give you their time, willing to give you their knowledge. People were so protective of all that kind of stuff in the NHS, and I think, why? We should be sharing knowledge. Surely that's what we're supposed to do. But people are so protective. We're now in a business, a competitive business, but people will still share their knowledge, and I just think that's fascinating. Everybody's working for each other, and I love that. I think it's amazing.
Well, that's my experience as well. That people they may move from one distillery to another, but they retain friendship with the staff they had at the previous distillery. There is a great sense of cooperation. Okay, there's rivalry, but nonetheless, there's a sense of amity and cooperation, which is absolutely delightful. And I've seen one or two examples of it, and they've been quite humbling. And as I say, this question of humor is also a great thing, because I remember many years ago, I had to go to Bowmore Distillery for organizing something there, and I took the manager and the chief engineer of the company, a famous Glaswegian called Harry Coburn, across to the hotel in Bowmore for lunch. And Harry, the previous evening, had been to a very good party, had drank to excess, and that day was rather pale and shaky and wan, and was not feeling at his best. But anyway, we got to the hotel, we went to the bar, and I said, "Well, gentlemen, what would you like to drink?" And Harry said, "Oh, I'm no drinking the day. I'll hear gin." That's it sort of always stuck with me as kind of the ultimate vignette of the whiskey industry.
Oh, that's brilliant. I'm not drinking today, I'll have a gin. Well, on that note, I think Brian, we could talk all night. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Mike's missed most of this chat, so I'm pretty sure Mike would be very pleased if we do this again at some point in the future. You're going to come in. Hopefully we'll. I mean, Mike will certainly be there. Hopefully, I'm around when you come in as well. If you give me enough warning, I can make sure I'm down at the shop if you're going to be around. But it'd be brilliant to do this in person for sure. James DeGuilo, book ordered. You will not regret it, James. It is an absolutely fabulous book. But, you know, it's all about the stories, everything that we're talking about. The history of Scotch is what whiskey's all about as well. As we all know, we're all fans. We're all in there for life.
Yeah.
So if you just stay on once we go off live, Brian, just so I can just say a quick cheerio to myself in person. But guys that are watching, thank you very much for tuning in tonight. I hope you've enjoyed the chat. I think it's been absolutely brilliant, and just a little bit different to some of the chats that we have had in recent times. Keeping on the theme of authors in particular, and we don't have anybody next week, guys. Mike and I are both busy on tasting, so the 10th is a free night for everybody. But the week after, on the 17th, we're going to be talking to Nick Morgan of Diageo, and Nick's obviously got a few books out there as well.
Wonderful guy.
Yeah, so we'll tune in on the 17th, Brian, and we'll find out what Nick's got to say about this, that, and the next thing. But thanks very much. And as we always say, if people haven't thought about a question just now that they might have wanted to ask, or they may be watching us later on, feel free to put a question into the chat, because Mike and I will look back and see if we can catch up with that, and we'll certainly pass the question on to Brian and see if we can get an answer to you. But yeah, thank you very much to everybody tonight. Thank you to you, Brian. And we'll see you all again on the 17th.
Okay.
Slàinte mhath.
Slàinte.